This is a LabVIEW Beginner lesson where we make a heart rate monitor. This is lesson 4 where we add modularity and functionality. As we've seen, when we move our finger, it affects the signal in such a way that it gets too big of a range and we can't see the small changes that the blood vessel blocks for the light in the finger. So if we want to suddenly take a break from measuring the pulse, but we don't want to wait the full 10 seconds for it to come back or more, then we can pause it and then move away, come back, and then resume it. We'll also be adding a common data cluster. In this cluster, we will keep the initial values of the application. In both the GUI and the acquisition, there will need to be decided an initial state. Either the program starts with running or it starts by being paused. We could do this manually by setting a default value, but then we need to update it 2 places if we want to change that. What we'll do instead is to add a place in the initialization where you set these values, and then both the GUI and the acquisition reads that value and knows if it should start running or it should start paused. We will start as always by adding the user event. It is a true-false user event, so we'll just copy this one. Remember to change the name or else the name will come in the user event and that will be very confusing if that's called stop. And I just mark this and hold Control, press space, and then press W and it auto-wires. And we'll need to add this one to the user events. Now we need to add it to the close. And we'll add a button in the acquisition. We call it pause acquisition. And then we can go inside here and have 2 different values. So when it's not, we can have running. And then when it's paused, we have paused. So, and we can also make yellow for paused and green for running. And let's make the big bigger. Running, paused. Now let's make a new user event for this. And since we're lazy, we'll just duplicate this one. Choose the new button here. Remove this duplicated button and change the user event. There you go. Now we're done on the GUI side. We need to go into the acquisition. So we could pause it from reading, but it doesn't really matter. So instead we'll just pause it from sending, because it can read as much as it wants, but if it doesn't send it to processing for analysis and then furthermore to the GUI, it doesn't really exist in our application. This is our helper loop, which receives external information. So we'll place it here and then transfer it upwards. And we can just hide the full names, as it's clear that this is user events. We add the user event here, and we can create a local variable here. And we'll add a case around this one, so when this is true, make this case false. So when it's true, it's paused, and when it's false, it's not. Create local variable, put it here. It seems we need a little bit more space, so we can just move this along. Change to read. We could drag this down so the error wire is clear, but then it would block for this one. So I'll just keep it up here. Let's test the functionality now. Running, and then it stopped. As you see, it went back to where we wanted it, and now we can never get it running again. This is because a lot of the buttons have this default action, which is latch when released, which means it automatically goes out again when it's read. This is a very handy feature for a lot of applications, but we want it to be in when it's in and out when it's out. So I change it to switch when pressed. So it only changes position when it's pressed. Let's try this again. And we see it's running now. We have stopped it or paused it, and it's running. I'll show you when it's useful. When I put my finger here, we'll see soon that it is blocked. So if I now want to keep it at that level, I can pause it, remove my finger, put it back again, and then unpause it. And you see it's at a very similar level, maybe not exactly the same level. But if I were to do that without pausing, we will see this jump. Now, we want the GUI and the acquisition to start in the same state. So we'll start by making a new type def, and here we'll set up a cluster. We'll call it initial state, and we'll save it as init. It's part of the init, so we'll just keep it with the init. And we can add the indicator from the GUI as it looks nice and has all the right naming. There. Auto size vertically, I like that one. So usually this would probably be some sort of configuration file which decides certain values. But this is not needed for our small application. But when you make larger application, just having a file where you read the initial values, maybe some device information, would be helpful. And we want this cluster to go into this cluster. Let's set our state here, initial state, pause acquisition, and we want it to be false because we want it to start running, and then we can rather pause it if that's what we want. And since this initiation cluster goes everywhere and this is part of it, now it will automatically go everywhere. This is the power of type defs. That's why it's so important to keep type defs. And we'll go here. We'll create a local variable, put it here. We can move this along a little bit, go up here. We don't need to put it as a GUI date, as they will never read the initial state later. But we can put it here. A way to make sure that this happens before everything else would now be to add a sequence event. So with this sequence event, you are sure that everything that happens in here happens before whatever happens after here. And this loop cannot start before it gets this data. So we are sure now that the pause acquisition will be set before this loop starts. And we need to add the same to the acquisition. Here we already have some sort of similar thing, so we can just expand upon that. We will need to set this one. If you copy a local variable, you will get a new button and a copy. So that doesn't work. You could always just create a local variable from here and this will work. But alternatively, you could just copy this by holding Control and dragging it, and you will be part of the same local variable. And we want to access here, so we'll just copy this unbundle by name. And what we want is the pause acquisition. And now they start from the same state. So if I start the application now, both will start running as in false, and then we can pause it, of course, stop it. But if I at a later point don't want it to start, I can just change it here from a false to a true, and now it will start paused, and I will press it to start it. So that's the power of having initial values and gathering them one place, because now everyone is dependent on what happens here, and you don't have to change it multiple places just to update the whole application. And we can add a little comment. Initial state. By adding a hashtag in front of it, we can find it later with the bookmark manager. And that's it for this lesson. We added a pause button for the acquisition, and we also added a cluster for initial values. In the next lesson, we'll add a simulated hardware so we can run the whole application without having the MyDAC connected.